Good evening. Uh, People are still coming in, but it's 7:02, so we will get started. This is S.K. Ghosh. I would like to, excuse me, welcome each and every one of you to the training and capacity building initiative of the S9 component of the Urban Resilience Project, the Rajuk part. This is the third week in our general and structural offerings. We did 2 seminars last week and 3 the previous week. Today, the topic, as you see, is earthquakes and their effects on structures. So this is, if you like, code background material. We do not get into code provisions in today's seminar. We have one seminar next week, and then we suspend the live seminars from the US for the month of Ramadan. You will have other training, either locally delivered live or pre-recorded training that we will play for you during the month. And then we will resume these seminars on May the 18th after Eid. So that is the program. The only other thing before I get started is you should have all received a PDF or downloaded a PDF copy of the slides I'm going to show you. That makes it possible for you to take notes, which I personally, when I attend a seminar, find to be a very desirable feature. Today, not for all seminars, we have made up this lesson objectives, which will tell you what we are trying to accomplish in these 2 hours and a quarter is our allotted time from 7 to 9:15, and then a 15-minute question and answer session. So upon completing this session, participants will recognize the background to the building code seismic provisions, including source, nature, and characteristics of earthquake ground motions, the nature of building response to ground motion, the concepts of frequency, period, damping, resonance, inertia force, and load paths. We come across these terms all the time. We need to know them exactly what they mean. The concept of inelastic structural response and consequent need for proper detailing. Some of this may not make a lot of sense as I read them, but that's the purpose of the seminar, to explain those things. And then seismic force resisting structural systems. Dr. Rakib did some of these, I think, in his first lecture. This will be maybe an expansion on what he covered. Let's start with earthquake ground motion. Most earthquakes, not all, result from rapid movement along the plane of faults within the Earth's crust. Sudden movement of fault releases a great deal of energy which travels through the Earth in the form of seismic waves. I think it's clearly written, and at this stage, I'm not going to add much. The seismic waves travel for great distances before finally losing most of their energy. So this is a picture that tells you what I was trying to say on the last slide. The Earth's crust is made up of a number of tectonic plates, which are in perpetual motion with respect to one another. The most of the faults, not all, are located close to plate boundaries. As the plates move, strains build up on the the two sides of a fault, which is essentially a weakness in the crust of the earth. When the strains overcome the resistance to movement, the fault ruptures. The precise location of the rupture is called the focus of the earthquake. The point vertically above the focus on the surface of the earth is called the epicenter. You will hear a lot about epicenter of earthquakes. Okay, so that's a point on the surface that is vertically above the focus, which is where the earthquake or the fault rupture originates. Seismic waves propagate from the source, and the horizontal projection, if you like, of the waves is shown on the picture. And then the waves have a potential to affect buildings, move the foundations from underneath the buildings. So that's what we are pretty much looking at. The next picture tells you that most earthquakes that happen in certain regions of the world and do not happen in other parts. Now, if you talk probabilities, there is no part of the earth where we can say with certainty an earthquake will never happen or can never happen. There is no such place. But the probabilities of earthquake happening is extremely low to the point of being negligible in many parts of the world. On the other hand, it is very, very high in other parts of the world. Uh, Around the Pacific Ocean, that is true. You see the locations of earthquakes that occurred in a period of 10 years. I think the picture is descriptive. The locations of the earthquakes, the colors indicate the depth of the focus. Shallow focus earthquakes are typically not large but can cause a lot of destruction because the focus is close to the surface. Deep focus earthquakes are big, and they invariably are destructive, obviously, if there are structures and things anywhere near the source of the earthquake. This picture shows the tectonic plate boundaries around the globe. And if you compare this picture with the previous picture, you will see that most earthquakes, not all, occur along the plate boundaries or at the plate boundaries. Now, when it comes to Bangladesh, I took 3 slides from a presentation by Professor Tahmid Malik Al Husseini of BUET. So this is obviously India, then Bangladesh. Bangladesh is located in a tectonically active region close to the plate boundaries of the north moving Indian plate and the Eurasian plate to the north and east. Lack of earthquake awareness and preparedness may lead to massive disaster if major earthquake strikes. This is why, or at least part of the reason why, the Urban Resilience Project. Recent tremors have frequently shaken the southeastern region near Chittagong. Some have caused damage. Now, these are strong earthquakes affecting Bangladesh, magnitude larger than or equal to 7. 61-year period from 1869 to 1930. This magnitude is something I will explain in a little bit. So in 69, Kachar earthquake, 1885 Bengal earthquake, you see the magnitudes here, 1897, Great Indian earthquake, 8.7 magnitude, which is extremely high. Sri Mongol earthquake, 1918, Dhubri earthquake, 1930. The important thing is no large earthquake in the last 50 plus years. Okay? So we just have been lucky. It is approaching 90 years of no large earthquake. Moderate damaging earthquakes in Bangladesh during the last 10 years. There is a list: May 1997, Sylhet, November 1997 near Burma border, July 99, Moheshkhali, December 2001. This is an earthquake near Dhaka. Uh, there was panic and injuries, as the slide shows. Uh, July of 2003 earthquake in Rangamati. So there has been no large earthquake, but there have been moderate earthquakes in the last 10 years, definitely. The next thing that I want to touch upon are these terms hazard and risk. They are quite often used synonymously, but they are not interchangeable. They are different things. Hazard is the potential for ground shaking or flood happening or a cyclone hitting. So the potential for something happening is the hazard. Risk is potential for losses if that something happens. Okay, so potential for losses, human loss, economic loss, all of that is associated with the hazard. So flood is a hazard. People dying of flood is a risk. Okay? And that tells you that earthquake risk depends on what type of structures we are looking at. If they're flimsy, the structures of shoddy construction, the risk is high in the same earthquake. If they're sturdy structures of sound construction, the earthquake risk is low, the earthquake hazard remaining unchanged. Okay? So hazard versus risk. Hazard is independent of the type of structures or infrastructure you have. The risk is very much dependent on what you have built and how. Earthquake ground motion. At some time after the generation, seismic waves reach the Earth's surface and set it in motion. The surface of the Earth is set in motion, which we refer to as earthquake ground motion. Very, very familiar term, those of us who deal with earthquake engineering. When earthquake ground motion occurs underneath a building, and when it is strong enough, it sets the building in motion. And the motion always starts with the building's foundation. The foundation is moved from underneath the structure. This motion of the foundation or the foundation transfers its motion throughout the rest of the building in a very complex way. This is, if anything, an understatement. Okay? So the foundation starts moving in an earthquake, and when I say start moving, it's not in one direction; it is every which way. And this movement is transferred to the rest of the structure in a complex way. These motions, in turn, induced forces in the structure. When the structure begins to move, there are forces induced that can produce damage. We will look at these things in more detail. Attenuation of ground motion. This is a term you will see all over the place. Attenuation is how ground motion dies down as it travels from source to site. Okay? So this is the focus. This is, if you are here in the near fault region where the distance from the fault is not large, this is the kind of ground motion you will see. It's the amplitude is high, the amount of movement, the frequency is high. The ground goes back and forth very rapidly. Okay, and then at a different location farther away from the source, you will find ground motion like this. Now the intensity of ground motion has decreased. how far the ground moves in one direction, that has decreased. The frequency has decreased. So there aren't so many back and forth movements in the same amount of time. Okay. And the duration of strong motion has increased. Here, the duration of strong motion is shorter. Here, the duration of strong motion is longer. So all of those things happen as you move away from the source. If you are far, you will the ground motion would have died out to some extent, so the movements of the ground and so forth will be less than in the epicentral region. There are all kinds of attenuation relationships that are proposed in the literature, and these are invaluable in trying to figure out the ground motion at a site away from the source. Uh, anyway, I don't want to go deep into any of this. So attenuation relationship shows how, in this case, the peak horizontal acceleration dies out as you go from. So the on the x-axis is closest horizontal distance from the zone of energy release. Okay. Now in the same earthquake, depending upon which measuring station you are looking at, you see how much scatter there is in the way the waves travel. Okay. We still we can decide whether we will go with median attenuation relationship or median plus one standard deviation or median minus one standard deviation. We can put an equation to this curve which will tell us how the ground motion dies away. And these are very useful, as I said, in figuring out the earthquake ground motion at a particular site. The next set of terms that cause a lot of confusion, very, very widespread, are this intensity versus magnitude. Okay? Earthquake intensity versus earthquake magnitude. Intensity is qualitative, very important as opposed to quantitative, but it is widely used. Magnitude is quantitative. So magnitude versus intensity. This is an analogy that Richter came up with. He was a seismologist that came up with the Richter scale that was very popular around the world. Now, not used all that much, but it is still a very important measure of magnitude. So seismographs, those are instruments, record waves of disturbance radiated from the earthquake source, just as receiving units catch radio waves transmitted by broadcasting stations. You have a radio, it catches radio waves transmitted by broadcasting stations. Similarly, a seismograph records waves of disturbance that are radiated from the source of the earthquake. Magnitude can be compared to the power output in kilowatts of a broadcasting station. Okay, this is very, very important. Magnitude can be compared to the power output in kilowatts of a broadcasting station. Local intensity is comparable to the signal strength of a receiver at a given locality. Okay, these are not the same things. The magnitude is how much power was output at the source at the broadcasting station, and intensity is the strength of the signal received at your unit. Intensity, like signal strength, drops off with distance from the source, although it also depends on local conditions and the pathway from source to the point of recording. This is all very important. With distance, the signal strength will die out. Everybody intuitively understands that. but the other factors that play a role in the signal that you will receive is the source to site transmission path, the path that the waves travel in coming from the broadcasting station to your unit, and local conditions where your unit is. And we will talk about each of these things in the earthquake context very soon. So earthquake intensity is subjective as opposed to objective, valuable for historic analysis. When we did not have magnitudes, we had intensity scales. Varies with construction type. This is very important. Okay, we talked about local conditions. If you don't have any structure, then there is no damage. Varies with distance and ground conditions. Okay, so distance from source to site, ground conditions, includes construction type and ground effects. So there are a number in this business of earthquake engineering. There is always whatever you look at, there is no one intensity scale. There are multiple intensity scales. Magnitude measure, there isn't one. There is a multiple. So modified Marcelli scale, however, is used in much of the world. And this shows that it gets serious when the modified Marcelli intensity is 8 or 9, some to considerable damage to even specially designed structures. 10, most masonry and frame structures destroyed, rails bent, landslides, ground badly cracked, etc. 11, few, if any masonry structure standing, bridges destroyed, pipelines out of service. 12 is almost total destruction. Okay, so below 8, it's not particularly serious, although there can be damage. And when you are looking at 10 or 11, it is very, very serious affairs. Magnitude is quantitative. Magnitude is the size of seismic wave that is recorded on a seismograph. Okay, the size of the wave. All magnitude scales are logarithmic. You go from magnitude 7 to 8. The magnitude 8 earthquake is 10 times as strong as the magnitude 7 earthquake. It's not a little bit strong. Okay, this is very, very important. So 7 to 8 is a tenfold increase in energy released at source. Correlates with energy released at source, as I just said. Moment magnitude is the preferred. So there was initially local or Richter magnitude. Now there is moment magnitude, surface wave magnitude, body wave magnitude, and others. Moment magnitude is more and more favored, but we will not go into all that stuff, and the numbers are not terribly different. That they are different, but not terribly. I mean, something that is 6 on one scale will not be 9 on another scale. It could be 6.2 or 6.3, whatever. Okay. So magnitude. Now, before I go further, this is something I want to mention. I I got this question within the last 3-4 days from, and there seem to be a sizable operation in Oregon. Anyway, the question was, when we design by code, what Richter magnitude earthquake are we designing for? That is essentially a senseless question. You cannot design for a Richter magnitude 6 earthquake, period. That statement does not make any sense until you say Richter magnitude earthquake on such and such fault. So you have a site. If you choose a particular fault, it is possible to design a structure at your site for a magnitude 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever magnitude fault at that particular fault. But just to say I designed for magnitude 6 earthquake is again a meaningless statement. Okay, so the you design for the ground motion at your site. A magnitude 6 earthquake at a particular fault will generate a ground motion 50 miles away, will generate a much weaker ground motion 100 miles away, and will generate no ground motion 200 miles away. Okay, so a structure 200 miles away can be designed for a magnitude 6 earthquake at your fault by doing nothing. So please keep this in mind whenever you hear our structures are designed for magnitude 8 earthquake. We are fine. That does not make any. The statement itself is without sense. Geological factors affecting ground motion at a site. So the source mechanism, the energy released at source is one thing. The type of fault, the amount of fault movement, how deep the focus is, all of those play a role in the ground motion that you will experience at your site. Those are source mechanism related factors. Then transmission path from source to site. Are the seismic waves coming through rock from the source to your site? Are they coming through alluvium? Are they coming through mud? So this will play a significant role. And then local site condition. Do you have rock where you are on the surface, or is there a deep soil deposit overlying rock? Because the soil overlying rock can magnify ground motion. That is very important, as you will see in some detail. So site effects. At a point here, so this is soft soil at the top, this is intermediate, this is rock, let us say. So within rock, this is the acceleration history. Acceleration caused by an earthquake looks like this as a function of time. On the surface, same earthquake, the acceleration history looks like this. So the soft soil overlying rock amplifies the ground motion. The amplitude has increased significantly, lengthens the duration of the ground motion, changes the frequency content, how many back and forth in what period of time. Okay, so all those things happen. Amplifies ground motion, lengthens duration, changes frequency content. We will talk about site effect or site amplification for 3 or 4 slides. So on the x-axis here is the period of the structure, which I haven't defined. Period very simply is if you set something in motion. Let's say you swing a pendulum. The time it takes for the pendulum to go from rest to one extreme position to the right to one extreme position to the left, come back to rest, is the period of the pendulum. Okay, so period of the structure is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the spectral acceleration divided by the maximum ground acceleration. Maximum ground acceleration, everybody understands. Spectral acceleration is maximum acceleration response of whatever structure you are looking at. Maximum is the important thing. Okay. So the spectral acceleration is for the steep site condition almost 3 times the peak ground acceleration, for one thing. But that's not the point. The point here is as you go from rock to stiff site conditions, to decohesionless soil, to soft soil, the spectral acceleration, the response of the structure increases. In a certain period range, the soft soil can amplify the rock motion very, very substantially. Okay? So I hope this is clear. This is a famous figure that was put together by Professor Harry Seed long time ago. Anyway, this is very fundamental, very revealing about site amplification. Same topic, 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in the San Francisco area. We will talk about that tomorrow. Okay, we are looking at two sites: Treasure Island, which is a soft soil site; Yorba Buena Island, which is a rock site. This is spectral acceleration at the Treasure Island site, soft soil. This is spectral acceleration plot at the Yorba Buena Island site, which is rock. Okay, you see the amplification due to soft soil. If you divide the soil amplification divided by the rock amplification and plot that as a function of period, you get this history. And the largest number here is almost 5. So the soft soil has amplified rock motion by a factor of 5 or so in this particular case. Now, the ground motion at a site, we are now looking at recorded ground motion. This one has been used around the world in analytical study. This is one of the first strong motion accelerograms. So accelerograph is the instrument. I talked about seismograph. Most of the time, these are strong motion accelerographs that we deploy around the globe. They measure ground accelerations, not velocities, not displacements, simultaneously in three orthogonal directions: two mutually perpendicular horizontal directions and the vertical direction. Okay. The particular record you see is from the Imperial Valley, California earthquake of 1940, as recorded at the El Centro, California site. This, at the time this was recorded, this is pretty much the one good strong motion record. Then by the time we had the 1994 Northridge earthquake, that generated more accelerograms than we had until that point in our history. And now anytime the earth moves, we have so many of these things. It's a flood now. These used to be very difficult to obtain. Now we are drowning in accelerograms. Anyway, so the top picture shows you the history of ground acceleration as a function of time. The thing that you see, this is characteristic of almost all earthquakes, and notice that I said almost nothing is true of all earthquakes. Earthquake ground motion is basically erratic. There is no pattern to it, typically. Okay. It's back and forth motion of the ground, and the frequency is very high. The back and forth motions are very frequent when you look at the accelerogram. If you integrate the accelerations once with respect to time, you get velocities. And this is the history of velocities. So these are the accelerations in the first figure integrated with respect to time. This is the history of ground velocities. You see that we now are looking at much less frequency. The velocities don't go back and forth as often as the accelerations do. And then if you integrate the velocities one more time with respect to time, you get the displacement history. This is the displacement of the ground, which we totally understand. Okay. And you see that this is not only not frequent, this is not only not as frequent as the acceleration, this is pretty much ponderous motion. Okay. So the ground goes back and forth, displaces back and forth, but not that frequently or not with the same frequency. Now, although this is one component of one earthquake, this is the north-south component of that particular earthquake. The general things I said are true of all earthquakes. The acceleration history is erratic. The velocities look less erratic. The period increases, the frequency decreases, the back and forth motions are not as frequent, and then you go to velocity, ground displacement, it is downright ponderous movement. Ground motion at a site. The earthquake ground motion characteristics that have the greatest importance for buildings are the duration of the earthquake, the amplitude of the earthquake in terms of displacement, velocity, or acceleration, and frequency of the ground. So duration, how long the strong motion lasts, the amplitude, and the frequency. So frequency is defined as the number of complete cycles of vibration made by the wave per second. Okay, one wave is one peak to the next valley to the next peak. Okay, so this is one wave. This is the wavelength. If you make two, so a complete cycle of vibration is from one crest of the wave to the next. Frequency is often measured in units called hertz. It is actually second to the power minus one. If two full waves pass in 1 second, then the frequency will be 2 second to the power minus 1. And second to the power minus 1 is also called hertz, 2 hertz frequency. Surface ground motion at a site is actually a complex superposition of different vibration frequencies. It is, you will never see ground motion with one frequency. That simply doesn't happen. It is a complex superposition of different vibration frequencies. At any given site, some frequencies usually predominate. The distribution of frequencies in a ground motion is referred to as frequency content. This term you will see all over the place. So the distribution of frequency, there are many frequencies in a typical ground motion. Some frequencies predominate at a particular location. The distribution of frequencies is referred to as the frequency content. Building response to ground motion. The response of a building to ground motion is as complex as the ground motion itself. Did you get that? So the response of a building to ground motion is as complex as the ground motion itself, yet typically quite different. This is important. The building response is different from ground motion. Building also begins to vibrate in a complex manner, and because it is now a vibratory system, it also possesses a frequency content. So the building movement also has a frequency content, different from the ground motion frequency content. However, the building's vibrations tend to center around one particular frequency that is known as its natural frequency. This is very, very important. The building's vibrations tend to center around one particular frequency that is known as its natural frequency. Another way to think of building response is in terms of building's natural period. Period is simply the reciprocal of frequency, as you see here. Okay, so T is 1 over F, or F is 1 over T. The unit of frequency is second to the power minus 1 or hertz. Period, the unit is second. Okay, so period is simply the inverse of frequency, whereas the frequency is the number of times per second that a building will vibrate back and forth. The period is the time it takes for the building to make one complete vibration cycle, as I said. Okay, so from rest to one position to the right, to one position to the left, back to rest. The time it takes is the period. This is extremely important. Period is proportional to square root of mass. So heavier buildings have long periods. A concrete building will have a longer period than a steel building, typically, if everything else is the same height, plan area, etc. Period is inversely proportional to square root of stiffness, inversely proportional. Stiffer the building, the shorter the period. Okay? So the heavier the building, the longer the period. The stiffer the building, the shorter the period. Short period buildings are stiff. They have short periods. Long or tall buildings have less stiffness. They are more flexible. They have longer period. Okay, so these are very important things. Proportional to the square root of mass, inversely proportional to the square root of stiffness. Okay, let us look at a couple of period and then damping. So this is a picture from FEMA, the FEMA publication, Federal Emergency Management Agency. They put out very useful stuff from time to time. So the idea is that you attach a rope to the roof of this building and then try to pull the rope by a tractor or something. And at one point you just cut the rope. If you do that, the building will start going back and forth. Okay, this is forward motion, this is backward motion, and this back and forth motion will go on for a while. If it is a simple building, most of the mass is here, the building will vibrate, go back and forth, following this kind of a regular motion where the period will be a regular period. Okay, you will see the back and forth motion takes the same time every cycle. You also see you also see that the amplitude dies down. Okay, by how much the building moves in one direction decreases with every cycle. And that last thing happens. Something got messed up. Sorry, Maria. Somebody wanted to annotate or something. I said yes, and now I cannot.
No.
But it is done. Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you. Yeah. So the dying out of the decrease in the amplitude is because of something called damping. Okay. So you swing a pendulum. It starts going back and forth. Newton's second law will tell you that this motion will go on up until the end of time. And if all of us know that it doesn't happen. The pendulum goes back and forth. Each time it goes by, it doesn't go quite as far as it did in the previous cycle. And ultimately it comes back to rest because of damping, which in the case of the pendulum is supplied by friction with the air. Okay. So in a structure, damping, the main source of damping is the damage. So the building goes back and forth in the earthquake. In the process of that, there is cracking, there is yielding of reinforcement, and so forth. That causes damping, which brings the building eventually back to rest. Now, there is an amount of damping at which, if the amount of damping is as high as a threshold value, then when you swing your pendulum, it will come back to rest without going back and forth about the position of rest. The minimum amount of damping that will do this, that will allow a body set in vibration come back to rest without oscillating about the position of rest, is called critical damping. Okay, so critical damping is shown here. Less than critical damping, you will have this kind of back and forth movement that will eventually die out. In structural engineering, we are dealing with 2%, 5%, at most 10% of critical damping, something like that. Okay, a steel building 2% critical damping, concrete building 5% with damage that may increase to 10% or more, but it is never 90% of critical damping. Then the concept of resonance. When the frequency contents of the ground motion are centered around the building's natural frequency. So the frequency content of the ground motions are centered around the building's natural frequency. The building and the ground motion are in resonance. Resonance tends to increase or amplify building response. Because of this, buildings suffer the greatest damage from ground motion at a frequency close to equal to their natural frequencies. Okay, this is all very important. If the natural frequency of the building is close to the dominant frequency of the ground motion, then there will be resonant response, and that can get out of hand. So at this point, I have a video which I think is excellent. Pro will take over the presenter role and show it. WebEx was causing these complications, and then he will give it back to me.
Now, what are the implications of these long period waves to our built environment, right? So here is a toy model consisting of, think of this toy model as your house, think of this as a, say, 5 to 8 story building, think of this as your 20-story building, and think of this as your 50-story building. Right, so I'm going to excite this model, this toy model, with high frequency motions, and you will see that the high frequency motion will selectively excite this low rise, this house, if you like, much more than this tall building, right? So that's the high frequency motion. So here's the high frequency motion now. Notice how the low-rise structure has gotten tremendously excited by this high-frequency motion, which is the motion, the ground going back and forth several times very quickly. Whereas the tall buildings, they are kind of waving a little bit, but they are more or less steady at this point. Right. So now I'm going to excite this toy model by what I would call long-period motion that goes back and forth like this that you saw here. That would be the kind of motion that you would see in a deep sedimentary deposit in a big earthquake, in the event of a big earthquake. So here is long period motion now on the same toy model. So here's long period motion. Notice how the little house is just sitting where it is, whereas the tall buildings or these long period structures are going back and forth, waving, getting a lot of response, right? So the long period motion does not do anything to the low rise structure. It selectively excites our tall buildings. This is the difference between long period motions that you can see in a big earthquake versus high frequency motions.
Yes.
Click on that. Sorry, share your screen.
Okay, I think we're okay, right? Okay, that was Dr. Krishnan, as you see, who was at Caltech at the time he recorded this video, which I thought was excellent. He is back in India someplace. I'm not, I don't remember exactly where. Now, along the same theme, uh, we are talking about resonance. Okay, so the accelerogram that you see on the screen was recorded at a downtown Mexico City location in the 1985 Mexico earthquake. We will talk quite a bit about it tomorrow. You will see the same slide again tomorrow. The point is that the accelerogram does not look anything like a typical accelerogram, which I said is kind of erratic. This motion is very regular with a fairly regular period of about 2 seconds if you could measure it. And that is because what you see is the response of the soft soils in downtown Mexico City to subsurface rock motion. Much of downtown Mexico City is built on an old Aztec lake bed, which means very soft soil deposits. People have likened it to jello that goes back and forth much uh, more frequently than the ball itself in an earthquake. And the soft soils of Mexico City had a predominant period of 2 seconds, which is reflected in this ground motion. This is the ground motion that downtown Mexico City structures experienced. The predominant 2 second period of the ground motion is very visible here. On the y-axis is spectral, well, let us say the velocity of the ground in this particular case does not make any difference what response quantity we look at. This is uh, anyway, let's not spend time on that. On the x-axis is period. The important thing is that the response peaks at a period of 2 seconds, which is the predominant period of the soft soil. So 2 second predominant period of the ground motion. So structures with a natural period of about 2 seconds would be the worst hit. Those would be, roughly speaking, 20-story frames. But there is a little more complication to that. As a concrete structure accumulates damage, its period increases. So you can start at 1.4 with damage, it increases to 1.6, 1.8, 2.0. Now it rides into the resonant range. So as a result of that, mid-height buildings were hit particularly hard in the Mexico earthquake. The picture you see is that of the Ministry of uh, Telecommunications or something like that. This is where the country's long-distance telephone equipment was housed, and Mexico lost telephone connection with much of the rest of the world as a result of this disaster. Okay? So this is a building in the medium height range that was the most vulnerable. The old colonial buildings, much shorter, therefore much shorter period than 2 seconds, did not have much problem at all. There was some plaster loss, something like that, but basically nothing has happened to the structure. And at the other end of the spectrum, the landmark Latino American tower, 40 stories or so, 4 second or so period was out of the range of the earthquake, and this building or buildings of this height did not have any problem either. So that tells you about the importance of resonance. Uh, Another depiction of the same effect that we are talking about. So these are buildings of various heights, and we plotted structural damage intensity on the y-axis and depth of soil on the x-axis. So the deeper the soil, uh, the deeper soil means we are looking at soft soil effects. Okay, if the soil, the depth of soil is very shallow, that means that your structure is on rock or very close to being on rock. So you see that if the depth of soil is low, the low-rise building exhibits high response. If the depth of soil is low, you are talking about rock. The predominant period of the ground motion will be short, and the short buildings will respond the most. As the thickness of the soil increases, the period of the ground motion, the predominant period will be longer, and now the taller buildings will be hit more. And that's precisely what you see in the picture. Okay, moving on. Inertia force. Acceleration has important influence on damage because as an object in motion, the building obeys Newton's law of motion. So, force is mass times acceleration, as we all know. Okay? So, a building moves back and forth. So, if you are on a floor, it undergoes displacement. The first derivative of the displacement is velocity. The second derivative of the displacement is acceleration. So the building is undergoing, or a floor is undergoing, displacement, velocity, acceleration, and the higher derivatives are also important for occupant comfort and so forth. Anyway, the acceleration times mass is a force. So the structure is now going to experience forces caused by this acceleration, and that has consequences. So the force acting on the building is equal to the mass of the building times the acceleration. So as the acceleration of the ground and in turn the acceleration of the building increases, so does the force which affects the building and the potential for damage to the building. Okay, so let me repeat. As the acceleration of the ground and in turn of the building increases, so does the force which affects the building and the potential for damage to the building. It is important to note that the force F is actually what's known as the inertia force. The force is created by the building's tendency to remain at rest and in its original position, even though the ground underneath is moving. Okay, so this is a picture. This is a structure. This is the foundation. The earthquake has all of a sudden moved the foundation from underneath the structure. The mass, which is at the floor of the roof level, does not want to follow the movement of the foundation. It wants to stay where it is. So when the foundation moves, to keep the mass where it was would require a force in the opposite direction to that of the earthquake. And that is the inertia force that is generated in the structure as a result of the motion of the foundation. Okay, inertia force. So if the ground acceleration is I'm sorry. This notation is pretty popular. UG double dot. U is the displacement, G is for ground. So the ground displacement, single dot is the first derivative, double dot is the second derivative. So if the ground acceleration is UG double dot, which is a function of time, the inertia force would be the mass times the ground acceleration, assuming there is no amplification of the ground acceleration in going from the ground to the mass. But the important thing is that the negative sign. The force is in a direction opposite to that of the earthquake. The inertia force is in a direction opposite to that of the earthquake. So in some circumstances, dynamic amplification due to near resonance that we talked about can increase the building acceleration to a value 2 or more times that of the ground acceleration at the base. So ground acceleration is 1 inch per second. You can have 3 inches per second acceleration at the roof level of a structure. Generally, buildings with higher natural frequencies or short natural periods tend to suffer higher accelerations but smaller displacements. So stiffer buildings will get higher accelerations, lower displacements. More flexible buildings will be the other way. Lower acceleration but larger displacements. This is how it goes. Okay, so in an earthquake, the foundation underneath the structure all of a sudden starts moving every which way. The rest of the structure, unless it is a very short, stiff structure, cannot readily follow the movement of the foundation. It lags behind and then tries to catch up with the movement of the foundation. In the process of that catching up, inertia forces are generated where the masses are, mainly at the floor levels and the roof level. And the challenge to us engineers in earthquake engineering is to take those inertia forces down from where they originate, namely the floor and the roof diaphragms, down to the soil underneath the foundation where all loads ultimately belong. So that's where the concept of load path comes in. We as engineers must provide paths for the loads to go from the point of application, or in this case, the point of origin. These are inertia forces, they originate within the structure where the masses are. We have to provide paths for them to travel down to the soil underlying the foundation. Okay. So this is what we are looking at the picture. This is the roof slab. When we use the word slab, we are thinking of out of plane bending due to gravity, okay, vertical, deflecting vertically downward. When the same slab is subject to earthquake forces in this case, which are in the plane of the slab, not perpendicular to the slab, not out of plane, this is in plane loading, then the slab will deflect like a horizontal beam. Okay, these edges, this particular edge of the when a slab is subject to in-plane bending, we refer to it as a diaphragm, not a slab anymore. Slab implies out-of-plane bending, diaphragm implies in-plane bending. So when this diaphragm is subject to lateral loading like this edge of the diaphragm will be in tension, this edge of the diaphragm will be in compression, and the edges of the diaphragm parallel to the earthquake forces will be in shear. Okay, I think you totally understand that. The and concrete being weak in tension, we have to provide reinforcement along that edge, which is called chord reinforcement. And earthquake direction always being reversible, we don't provide chord reinforcement along one edge. We will provide chord reinforcement along the other edge also, because when the earthquake direction changes, it is directed from right to left. This edge, uh, the left edge will be in tension and the right edge will be in compression. Anyway, those shears along the parallel edges will get transferred to the supporting frames or shear walls, which will bring them down to the foundation. And the foundation will transmit the loads to the soil. That is the whole idea. And these frames or shear walls are vertical elements of the seismic force resisting system. You will see this term all over the place. Vertical elements of the seismic force resisting system. In concrete, they are frames, shear walls, or combinations thereof. Okay, we don't have a lot of variety. Trusses are very uncommon, so it is frames, shear walls, or combinations thereof. So load paths from point of load application or origin down to soil underlying foundation. The load paths that we provide should preferably be direct, which comes from simple configuration of our building. Too many offsets and this and that, turns and rounded. Anyway, the more complicated the configuration goes, the less direct is the load path. We also want multiple load paths, ideally, more than one way for the loads to go from origin to the soil underlying foundation. And that is the concept of redundancy that you keep on hearing about, multiple load paths. Okay, now a kind of a change of uh, pace, if you like. So, earthquake damage mechanisms. Ground shaking obviously can cause earthquake damage. And that's what we have been talking about pretty much from the beginning or for a while. But there is also ground failure, which can be rupture of the ground in an earthquake, liquefaction of the ground, landslide, or lateral spreading of the ground. Then there is tsunami and Seiche, which are similar things, and we will explain. So ground motion first. Seismically induced ground motions produce inertia forces in structures, and these may cause complete collapse, partial collapse, building interaction, hammering, we typically call it, or interior damage. So this is an instance of complete collapse. This is Agadir, Morocco, earthquake, 1960. Old picture. Anyway, the picture is graphic enough. Left picture shows you a building standing. The right picture shows you the same building in a heap after the earthquake. Okay, nothing redeemable here. Partial collapse. This is a very famous picture of a very famous building in a very famous earthquake, 1971 San Fernando earthquake. It is famous because our seismic codes, US seismic codes, changed beyond recognition following this earthquake. 1973 edition of the Uniform Building Code introduced ductile concrete. concrete that is properly detailed. Pre-1973 concrete and post-1973 concrete are totally different materials. So one has to understand that. And anyway, so this is the Olive View Memorial Hospital in the San Fernando Valley. It was pretty brand new at the time of the earthquake and suffered partial collapse, as we say here. If you look, this shear walls, the face of the building, this space of the building, those shear walls are discontinued at this level, and then they are supported on columns at the ground level, which is pretty typical. The most of the columns were typical of columns of those days. Plenty of longitudinal reinforcement, hardly any transverse reinforcement. Ties at 14 inches or so, no cross ties, no 135-degree hooks, no ties in the joints. This building is standing only because there were a couple of spirally reinforced columns with very tight pitched transverse reinforcement. Those columns stood up so the building didn't fall to the ground. So it's quite a quite an experience. Uh, Building interaction. Two buildings close to each other, not enough gap in an earthquake. One building hits against the other, and you see the consequence in the right hand picture. I will show you more of this tomorrow. Okay, so building space too close together can hammer together and cause severe damage. And I have a lot of stuff. Obviously, have to be very selective in what I can show you within the time limitation. Interior damage. This is so common that I cannot even tell you. This is a picture after the San Fernando earthquake. Could be any building. You see the false ceiling, and here it is intact, but there it has come down. And then this is not anywhere near as bad as you see. At the very end, I will show you a video that will, I think, impress you. Ground failure, fault rupture, liquefaction, landslide, lateral spread. Fault rupture. So this was one fence before the earthquake. The ground has ruptured in an earthquake, and you see now there is an offset. In Turkey, after the 1999 earthquake, I won't be able to tell you the name of the place. Anyway, I saw with my own eyes, fault rupture had gone through somebody's bedroom. Part of the bedroom was here, and the rest of the bedroom was a good 6 to 8 feet away. Okay. This can happen. I have, as I said, seen with my own eyes. Okay. So fault rupture. Liquefaction. Loss of shear resistance in saturated soil caused by seismically induced ground vibrations. So this is a famous picture from Niigata, Japan, 1964. The whole building has toppled over because the piles have pulled out. Saw so many instances of this in the Bhuj earthquake. I think it was 2000 or so in Gujarat, India. I think I have some pictures tomorrow, although I didn't see a picture of. Anyway, so this is less uncommon than you would think. Lateral spread, you see the term, I think, is descriptive. After the Chile earthquake 2010, saw so much of that in many parts. Landslides. Bangladesh, I think, is lucky that way. You don't have a lot of mountainous regions. This is very common even without earthquakes if you are in the mountains. Anyway, here landslide because of earthquake, and there is no defense against it. What are you going to do? This is beyond engineering. You cannot engineer for something like this or this. Look at that. The railway lines. Uh, uh, the landslide has, you know. So these are devastating things. Some of it we can do something about. Other things we better stay away. Tsunami is seismically induced sea wave. You probably have heard plenty about it in recent times. We have added tsunami resistant design in ASCE 7 in the 2016 edition. It is pretty complicated stuff. Uh, yeah, today is not the day to go into whether there is tsunami danger for Bangladesh and so forth. But anyway, the tsunamis are devastating, devastating. I have no other word for it. Okay, I have seen entire communities totally wiped out after this Tohoku earthquake, the last big one in Japan. Seiche is seismically induced fluid motion in a reservoir or lake. Reservoir or lake. So tsunamis are in the ocean. Seiches are in inland bodies of water. Same phenomenon. This is the Tohoku earthquake pictures. So this is a community before the tsunami hit, the same community afterwards. This is aerial picture. No details are visible, but I think the message is clear. The picture is that of total utter destruction. So ground shaking, the scope of effect of ground shaking is wide, and we can design to resist ground shaking. Fault rupture you cannot do anything about. The effect is local, and you better avoid it. If you have knowledge that uh, that there is an active fault, you better not build on it. It's as simple as that. Landslide is the same thing. You cannot engineer against landslides. You better avoid landslides or build where there is no danger, known danger of landslide. Liquefaction, avoiding is definitely an option, or you can do something about it. You can improve your site by injection of cement and things like that. Tsunami, uh, better to stay away, but these days we can design tsunami resistant structures. And size is the same as tsunami. We it's probably better to avoid, but if we need to, we can design to withstand the effect of sizes. Okay. Now a this is how, what do I want to say? I now want to get into the very basis of the seismic design that we do by our codes. Okay? The very basis. And let me take the time to explain this idealized picture. That's very important, as clearly as I can. So what you are looking at is the response of a particular structure to a particular earthquake. That's important. One structure in one earthquake. The displacement suffered by the structure in going through the earthquake are along the y-axis, along the x-axis, and the forces that are induced in the structure, the lateral forces, as a result of the earthquake are on the y-axis. Initially, we are talking about elastic response. Elastic response does not necessarily mean force proportional to displacement. That is unnecessary. That is nonlinear elasticity. Elastic means no residual displacement. The earthquake passes, you get your structure back intact and located where it was before the earthquake, not a couple of feet away, which can happen. Okay. So elastic response. The elastically responding structure suffers a total displacement capital delta sub u and develops a force equal to capital F sub u. If I now turn around and say we are required to design this particular structure for elastic response to this particular earthquake, the immediate conclusion would be that we must supply the structure with a strength level at least equal to F sub u. If we decide that we cannot afford a strength level that high, that all we can afford is a much lower strength level F sub E, what will happen if the same earthquake now comes, hits our structure? When the earthquake induced forces equal and then exceed the supplied strength level F sub E, the structure will start cracking and yielding in places. That will be the end of elastic behavior and the beginning of inelastic response, which will not follow the flat top as in my idealized diagram, but the fact is that we now are looking at damage. We are looking at cracking. We are looking at yielding of the reinforcement. We are looking at the structure having to be repaired following the earthquake. Okay. Now, we do not want the inelastic displacements. Well, no, another important thing. The elastically responding structure and the inelastically responding structure develop about the same total displacement. Not precisely the same as in my idealized picture, but about the same. The big difference between the strong structure and the weaker structure is that in the case of the strong structure, the total displacement is elastic, recoverable. In the case of the weak structure, part of the displacement is inelastic, has damage associated with it. Okay. Now, the damage should not cause collapse of the structure. So as the structure undergoes these inelastic displacements associated with damage, we want the gravity loads, the factored gravity loads, to be still sustained by the structure. The structure should continue to carry them. And here comes the concept of inelastic deformation capacity. So the larger the displacement range, larger the range of inelastic displacements over which gravity can be sustained, the higher the inelastic deformation capacity, and the lower the range of inelastic displacements over which gravity can be sustained, the lower the inelastic deformation capacity. If we have a high inelastic deformation capacity, we can design for quite low design forces. Okay, we can design for a design force level as low as that if we have deformation capacity as large as that. If we have low deformation capacity, a short range of inelastic displacements over which gravity can be sustained, then we need to design for a higher level of force. So this business of ours of earthquake engineering is essentially a trade-off between strength and inelastic deformation capacity. The higher the strength, the lower the need for inelastic deformation capacity. The lower the strength, the higher the need for inelastic deformation capacity. Inelastic deformation capacity comes from proper detailing of the structural members and joints. And this is why our building codes have detailing requirements for structural members and joints of all materials. The design force levels given in the code and the detailing requirements go hand in hand. One without the other does not make any sense, never has made any sense. Okay. So the code prescribed seismic design force level goes hand in hand with the code prescribed detailing requirements. Seismic design has these two important parts. You design for strength, but you also detail for inelastic deformation capacity. Okay. Now, our codes and BNBC is modeled after US codes. In BNBC also, we have three recognized levels of detailing: ordinary, intermediate, special. Let us forget for now about the seismic design categories. That's another discussion. So ordinary detailing will give us low inelastic deformation capacity. We will need to design for higher strength. The special detailing will give us high inelastic deformation capacity. We will be allowed to design for low force levels, and intermediate is intermediate. It gives us something in between the ordinary and the special. The tie between the strength and the inelastic deformation capacity is the response modification factor R that you see in the design base shear equation of the code. If you have special detailing, we will give you a higher R value to design with. R is in the denominator of the design base shear equation. You will have a lower design base shear. If your detailing is ordinary detailing, your R value will be low and your design force level will be high. Okay? So ordinary, intermediate, special detailing. Now the earthquake force resisting structural systems. We have basically four recognized systems. And then everything else is called undefined structural systems. In BNBC, they are called special structural systems. The first is moment resisting frame system, where beam column frames or slab column frames, as may be, carry gravity as well as lateral loads. There are no shear walls doing anything significant for you. Okay, so the same frames carry gravity loads and lateral loads due to earthquakes. Moment resisting frame system. Second picture shows you what is now called the bearing wall system. Shear walls by definition carry in-plane lateral loads in addition to gravity, in plane as opposed to out of plane. So in a bearing wall system, shear walls carry gravity loads, and the same shear walls also carry lateral forces due to earthquakes. There are no frames doing anything significant for us. So, moment resisting frame system, bearing wall system. Then there are two combination systems, dual system and building frame system. Duals in a dual system, we combine shear walls and frames in a particular way. If you have shear walls and frames in the same building, and you analyze the shear wall frame building under lateral loads, properly analyze it, you will see that near the bottom of the building, almost 100% of the shear goes to the shear walls, with the columns carrying very little for you. As you move up the buildings, the shear walls unload on the frames. The shear walls carry less and less, the frames carry more and more. If it is a tall building at the very top, there can be reversal. The frames carry more lateral loads than the shear walls. Shear walls now, anyway, you get the picture. So there is a reversal. But that happens only in tall buildings. So when you are designing a dual system, you as the engineer may not decide that you will design the shear walls to carry 80% of the lateral loads and the frames to carry the remaining 20%. That is not your decision. The structure gets to decide. You will have to design your building according to the results of your interactive analysis. As I said, near the bottom, the shear walls will carry most of the lateral loads. As you go up, the frames will carry more and more, and you have to design on that basis. Now, if you just design on that basis, the columns in the lower parts of your building will be very weak, very flimsy, because they do not carry any lateral forces. So there is the concept of the backup frame. We do not want such weak columns in the bottom portions of our building. So the frames, independently of the shear walls, must be designed to resist 1/4 of the design lateral forces. This is the concept of the backup frame that has been with us since the San Fernando earthquake. The idea is, if something should happen to the shear walls in an earthquake, the frames should still be standing up, carrying gravity loads for us. Okay, so dual system. The other way of combining shear walls and frames in the same building is by going with a building frame system. This nomenclature is kind of confusing. It is not a frame system. A building frame system has shear walls and frames. Here, we split the gravity resistance from lateral resistance. In a building frame system, substantially all the gravity must be carried by essentially complete frames. The two words substantial and essentially I did not throw in for effect. Substantially all the gravity loads means that the weight of the walls do not have to be carried by the frames. Substantially all the gravity has to be carried by essentially complete frames. The frames don't have to be 100.00% complete, but they have to be essentially complete. And the shear walls must resist 100% of the lateral forces. So the substantially all the gravity is carried by essentially complete frames. Shear walls carry 100% of the lateral forces. There is something else. You have to absolutely make sure that the frames will continue to carry full factored gravity loads as they deform together with the seismic force resisting shear walls all the way up to the design earthquake displacements. This is the very important concept of deformation compatibility which is an integral part of the definition of the building frame system. You must always, always understand that. Okay, so moment resisting frame system, bearing wall system, dual system, building frame system. 4 basic systems, everything else is undefined, must be designed in comparison with one of the defined systems. But then there is also the 3 levels of detailing: ordinary, intermediate, special. So we don't have one moment resisting frame system. We have an ordinary moment frame, we have an intermediate moment frame, we have a special moment frame. And then there are materials of construction. There are moment frames of concrete, there are moment frames of steel. There was a time when they tried to introduce moment frame of masonry, but that didn't quite, the marketplace didn't react all that well, so it is no longer there. And you don't build frames with wood, but steel and concrete, and these days there is composite steel and concrete moment frames. So there are 3 levels of detailing, there are different materials of construction, and 4 basic structural systems. All together, we have a lot of choices, as you will see as we take you through the details of code provisions. Okay. Different categories of concrete moment frames and shear walls recognized by US codes and standards. So when it comes to moment frames, we have ordinary reinforced concrete moment frames, ordinary, that can be cast in place or precast. We have intermediate reinforced concrete moment frames that are cast in place only. There is no precast moment frame. And special reinforced concrete moment frames can be cast in place or precast. Shear walls, ordinary reinforced concrete shear walls can be cast in place or precast. There is an intermediate precast shear wall, but that is precast only. There is no cast in place intermediate shear wall. And then special reinforced concrete shear walls can be cast in place or precast. So interestingly, intermediate moment frame is always cast in place. There is no precast recognized in our codes. The intermediate shear wall, if you are going to build one, is always precast. There is no cast in place recognized in our codes. Precast, I do not think is that big yet in Bangladesh, so we probably won't talk much about it in subsequent days and in subsequent courses. But that's that's where things are. Okay, I am pretty much done, quite a bit ahead of time, but I have an important video that I would like you to watch. So we will do the same thing. Pro will take over, show you the video, then he will give it back to me, and I will take your questions. So it will be a longer question and answer period if you have questions. So we'll see.
Dr. Ghosh, would you like to say a few things about this video before I begin?
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. So what you are about to see is a large scale building. I don't remember that it was full scale, but it was a large scale actual building, multi-story, multi-bay, that was tested at the outdoor shake table at the University of California, San Diego. The purpose of the testing was to study the response of the non-structural elements within the building. That was really the main purpose. So one floor of the building was furnished as a hospital surgical floor. Another floor was a hospital patient floor where patients lay in bed but did not undergo procedures like surgery. One was a school room floor. Another was an office floor. There was a fifth floor. I forget now, probably like residential apartment kind of furnishings. It was a functioning building, a functioning staircase from the bottom to the top, a functioning elevator, the usual things on the roof, water tank, HVAC, the equipment that is typically mounted on the roof, all of that functioning. This is very, very important. Part of the cladding was precast heavy cladding. The rest of the cladding was EIFS. I don't know if you have it in Bangladesh. That's the light. I forget what EIFS stands for. Anyway, synthetic light material that is used for cladding. That's pretty popular material. So it was, as I said, tested on an outdoor shake table under varying magnitudes of ground motion, and you will see what happened to the structure and the non-structural elements within. Okay? So that's a very short introduction.
May 15. Finally, it is time for the ultimate test, the maximum considered earthquake ground motion. This is an earthquake with a 2,500-year recurrence interval. Codes and designs for this motion have the performance expectation that the building will not collapse, but will lose functions and be severely damaged beyond repair.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, running.
The violence and severity of the quake is clear. This would be a frightening experience not soon forgotten. The forces and displacements on the structure are extreme. At points during the shaking, floors 2 and 3 are displaced by nearly a foot in both directions. The heavy upper cladding is shaken violently, but remains attached. The lower cladding tears like paper. Interior furnishings are thrown about by the violent accelerations. Those that are unrestrained are tossed about like so many toys, while anchored items ride out the seismic storm, jerked to and fro along with the walls and floors to which they are attached. Close inspection reveals that the building suffers irreparable damage.
I think this building in a real world situation would be condemned. The columns, the base of the columns, the concrete is falling off, especially the two columns on the east. There is a beam at the top of the first story where there is a full plastic hinge formation with a lot of concrete that detached. You see these blocks of concrete here. We can see the rebars. They are naked now. At different floors, you can see the formation of the punching failure mechanism of the slab around the column, not far from really collapsing. From the third floor to the fourth floor, the stairs are detached, they are hanging. There are a lot of gypsum board, huge gypsum board that detached, that fell off. At every floor, the frame of the elevator door has been seriously damaged. The doors are locked, in an oblique fashion.
But the building has done its duty. It bent and cracked, but did not collapse.
It satisfied the design objective. The structural system should still stand, even though maybe close to collapse, but still stand.
Okay, so I think the very important point that Professor Conti was making, and this is really important, is that when we design by our codes, we design to avoid collapse in what is called the maximum considered earthquake. The maximum considered earthquake, at least in BNBC, here it has gotten complicated, but in BNBC 2020 edition, is the 2500 return period earthquake, an earthquake that is expected to occur once in 2500 years. Okay, so we are designing to prevent collapse in that earthquake. We are not designing to prevent damage in that earthquake. That would require elastic response to the maximum considered earthquake. That will be absurdly expensive, and it does not make sense to spend that money on something that may or may not happen. This is the thing about earthquakes. California, for instance, the most seismically active state within the United States, has not had a major earthquake since 1906. That was the Great San Francisco earthquake. Since then, there have been many earthquakes. 1989 Loma Prieta or San Francisco area earthquake, we will talk about tomorrow. 1994 Northridge earthquake, we will talk about tomorrow. Those are major events, much damage, many deaths, but they are not major earthquakes. California is probably overdue for one. At the same time, it may happen tomorrow. It may not happen for the next 200 years, which is beyond all of our lifetimes. So there is only so much we can afford to do for a danger that may or may not come. Having said that, up until a point in time, at least I didn't detect a lot of unhappiness over the fact that a code design structure is expected to undergo damage in the so-called design earthquake, which is 2/3 of the maximum considered earthquake. It has largely been considered acceptable, although not widely understood. So after every earthquake, when people see damage, there are complaints, and the complaints are typically motivated by a lack of understanding that that's our design basis. We don't try to design to prevent or even minimize damage in the design earthquake. Now that seems to be changing. Society now seems to want this resilience, the community to recover very quickly after a disaster. Okay, people are not happy anymore with the basis of earthquake design that we have lived with for so many years. So I expect some changes in the relatively near-term future, but we definitely are not there. Definitely BNBC 2020 is what Professor Conti is talking about. as long as your structure has not collapsed in the maximum considered earthquake, you should be happy. There is damage, yes, the damage is expected. Hopefully, the damage will be repairable. In the case of this test structure, the damage is not repairable. As he said, the building is not redeemable. You have to get rid of it and build something in its place. Okay, with that, I was afraid that I'll be short of time today. I do not exactly know how it happened. We are ahead of time. It's difficult to judge these things. Anyhow, I haven't quite done this seminar before. So I am open to questions, and somebody has to help me look at the, yeah, Maria. Okay, so I will read the questions. Obviously, this is the first time I'm reading them. I may or may not be able to answer. Let us see where we go. So, to performing time history analysis, which ground motion data can we use according to BNBC 2020? If we have to consider 7 earthquake records, then which records can we use for our purpose? This I cannot answer for you right on the spot. There must be information available. There is Bangladesh Geologic Survey. I know that there is ground motion information available from them. And this ensemble of 7 records has now become 11. I think in BNBC 2020 it is still 7. But anyway, you need to get hold of what is available, and then having knowledge of your site, you have to choose the right 7, and that there is ample guidance and literature available on how you make that kind of a selection. But I cannot give you specific answer without looking into the situation in Bangladesh. What is the difference between base shear and design spectral acceleration? Very good question. We know the function of base shear, which need to determine seismic force, but why we calculate spectral acceleration and what is the function of spectral acceleration in design. Yeah, so the short answer is the base shear is the spectral acceleration multiplied by mass. So this is why we go to spectral acceleration. Now, it's not easy to answer a. Let me think for a second. I can go to. Let me. How many questions are there?
Seems like there's a lot. 52.
Oh. No, there are 52 questions, so I cannot go to. I could find a slide that explains the concept of the response spectrum, and from that, design spectrum. Spectral acceleration, as I said earlier, again, this is a very short answer, is the maximum acceleration that a structure or another body will experience subject to ground motion. Okay, it depends on damping and so forth. If we know the maximum acceleration, then we can calculate the base shear, which is the maximum acceleration times mass, and base shear is the resistance that we have to build into an earthquake resistant structure. So that is the short answer. If there is an opportunity at some point somehow, I will share more details. If we analyze
just to add about the base shear question, we have other segments coming up in this webinar series.
We have the
we have seismic design, segments. Yes, and in that, this question would be answered in more detail. The content itself will answer this question.
Okay, that's good. I have now forgotten what we included.
Yeah.
Okay.
We do.
Okay. Thanks, bro. So if we analyze a concrete building in software, then software will automatically generate time period based on C sub T or CT and M value. What is CT? I don't know. Besides, we have to calculate time period manually. We observe that software calculated time period values is much more than manually calculated time period. Then how to adjust this two time period and why software calculated time period are more? Please explain. I do not know that that is true as a general rule. That is not our experience. Maybe Pro can answer this question as well as I can, or better than I can. That is not. I mean, you
Well,
state it as if it is always the case. That is not our experience.
Well,
If yeah, go ahead.
Actually, okay. So first thing is the software could calculate C sub T and M, but typically the value that you're referring to, that is generally larger than the manually calculated time period, is the one that the software calculates using dynamic analysis. Rather, I should say using a
Modal response spectrum.
modal analysis, not response spectrum, but modal analysis. And when you say manually, that is when that is where you use the C sub T and M values. That is your manual calculation. Software does it too if you specify your C sub T and M values. But that is basically your manual calculation. And the manual calculations are specified in the code, like the C sub T and M values are specified in the code with the thinking that the manually calculated period would be conservative because it is not accurate and approximate, so it should be conservative. So and typically the conservative period is the one that is the smaller, because smaller the period, you have larger the base shear.
No, now I know the answer to the question. This manually calculated threw me off. So you are talking about approximate period of the code, as we call it, by the formulas in the code. Those approximate periods are deliberately chosen to be shorter than quote unquote real period of the structure, because the shorter the period, the larger the design base shear, the more conservative your design. Okay, so now that I understand that you are talking about approximate period, yes, analytically computed period will be almost always larger than. In my long professional life, I saw one exception to this, one exception, where the analytical period was shorter than approximate period, but it is basically always larger. And as I said, it is the approximate period formulas are deliberately that way. They are designed to give us a period shorter than what we expect the real period of the structure to be. Okay, I didn't catch on to the question because of the language. Okay. Selected. So
just to remind everyone that on May 25 we have Seismic Design 1, and May 26 we have Seismic Design 2 webinars coming up. And I think many of the questions I'm seeing right now, they will be, I think, answered in those segments. So just if you want to skip ahead and address the questions that are more relevant to the topics discussed today.
Okay, what about the next one? What is normalized acceleration response spectrum? Will that be the next time?
It should be. I mean, this is just basically C sub S, the calculation of base shear. I mean,
Yeah.
again, I don't know the exact content that would be there, but it seems to me that
Yeah. So
these are
let
some basic concepts that would be discussed in Seismic Design 1 and Seismic Design 2.
yeah. So the C sub S, for those of you who may not be catching on, is the design base shear coefficient, as we call it. Design base shear is C sub S times the seismic weight of the structure. Okay? And if the question is about C sub S, I agree with Pro that it will be better. I think the answer will be clear when we go through that segment. If not, we can revisit it at that time. What the long period transition period values we should use according to BNBC 2020. Yeah, that is a good question. So this question refers to the design spectrum in BNBC 2020 has three branches. There is a flat top, which is the constant acceleration part of the spectrum. Then there is a descending branch that varies with 1 over t, that is the constant velocity part. And then there is a third part that varies with 1 over t squared, period squared, and that is the constant displacement part of the spectrum. The third part starts at a period called long period transition period, T sub L. That value for the US is 4, 8, 12, or 16 seconds. But in BNBC 2017, that value is given in the code itself. I cannot tell you exactly where Dr. Rakib probably could, but he is not has been made a presenter. But I know for sure that it is tabulated in the BNBC 2020. You will find the value if you go to the right place. If torsional irregularity exists for seismic design category D, then accidental torsion must be amplified by amplification factor. How to amplifying the torsion and what is the process of this is also covered in detail in a later segment, so I will not try to answer this one today. Okay. What is the definition of non-building structure? Very, very good question. Can I consider concrete overhead water tank as non-structural structure? I think you want to say non-building structure. Okay, so what is the definition of non-building structures? First of all, okay, so there are buildings and non-building structures. Here's the difference. In a building, people habitually live and or work. Okay, they live and or work, which means by definition, in a non-building structure, people do not live and people do not work. That does not mean people never go in. They may go into a non-building structure to read instruments or to do repair work or things like that. But that is the essential difference. In a building, people live and work and or work. In a non-building structure, people do not live and or work. Now, it gets more complicated when in a non-building structure, you may have a mezzanine on which some activities are carried out from time to time. So there are some gray areas, but typically to tell a non-building structure from a building is not difficult. Okay, it is the basis is what I indicated to you. Now, you didn't quite ask in your question, but there are non-structural elements and non-building structures. Non-structural elements are chapter 13 of AC 7, non-building structures are chapter 15. Some non-structural elements are very easy to to figure out, like the light fixtures, the false ceilings, and all that is non-structural. But there are some other stuff If there is a tank mounted on your roof, it is a non-structural element, is it a non-building structure? Sometimes the distinction is not that clear cut. But anyway, if that interests you, I have a very good reference that I can cite where you can go to have an appreciation for the difference. Yeah, Maria is helping me, so it is taking a little time. I do not know how to go from one question to another. Okay, what is the definition of non-building structures? We just went through that. Can I? I didn't answer your specific part. Can I consider concrete overhead water tank as non-structure? Okay, so concrete overhead water tank will be in the category, as I said, if it is mounted on the structure, depending upon some things, it may be a non-structural component or a non-building structure. I cannot tell you without more particulars. Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. What? No. There was one before that.
Oh, this one. Oh, yeah, this one.
No. Yeah. What are the overturning effects limits for earthquake and wind according to BNBC 2020? My query is, I calculate story mass, story weight, and I get resisting overturning moment. Then I compare this resisting overturning moment to induced overturning moment. If I divide these two moments, then I get a value. Then how can I ensure that my structure is safe against overturning moment? It seems to me that you are talking about structural stability rather than safety. The the overturning moment has to be smaller than the the moment that is resisting the overturning, which is the dead load of the structure times the distance from one edge to the dead load. So this is a basic stability check, and I do not know exactly what to tell you, except look at the code under stability check or stability. You are not talking about safety. Okay, basic stability, which we do check, and that is typically a factor of at least 1.5 that we provide between the resistance and the cause. Slides are not moving. That's not a question. So somebody had a problem. Okay. Shake frequency or magnitude. Which one is the most important factor to know for a structural engineer? Frequency or magnitude? You need to know both. You need to know the history of ground motion. I do not know what to say about I don't think it is one or the other. You need to know you need to know definitely both and more. The duration, for instance. I have some confusion how to meet requirements of ACI 318 code for concrete frame analysis. What is the intent of 318.11 section 87881.882? Here is my understanding. ACI 318.11 section 881.882 for frame drift, member deflections and foundation pressures based on section 881 for columns 981G. Something of this level of detail is difficult to, if we want, let me see, if we, what is the rest of it? No, there was more to the question.
No, I think that's it. No, I think that's it. I think this is.
So here is my understanding. SCI 31811, section 881 and 882 for frame drift, member deflections and foundation pressures based on section 881 for columns 981G, for beams 491G. I do not know exactly where. Let me not spend time on this question. It is so detailed that, and this has almost nothing to do with today's seminar, obviously. So let me keep it for the future. It will. I do not know if it will come up in. No, we are not going into. Let me see what I can do with this. We have to answer a lot of questions, and this will be added to the list. At factored load combinations for member design forces and reinforcement design for columns 7 I sub G, for beams 35% I sub G. If we want code also allows you to 0.5 I sub G for both columns and beams based on 882B. Here I write my observation that what I realize about crack section is my observation is right or wrong. This is related to the other one. Let me say some basic things. I think that may be helpful. So there was a time before computers. No one in the audience probably remembers that. We used to do structural analysis before there were computers. And what we had to do is to render a highly non-redundant structure into redundant structures by making simplifying assumptions. And this is how the World Trade Center was built, designed and built. It's not so long ago. Anyway, then computers came 60s. By 70s, they were important in design offices. To analyze a non-redundant structure, we have to make stiffness assumptions. So every design office had their stiffness assumptions that they made. And all of that was fine. Typical was about 100% of gross for columns and shear walls, and about half of gross for beams. That was kind of where things were. ACI 318 left it to the designer and still leaves it to the designer. I absolutely want to emphasize that. ACI 318 does not tell the designer what stiffness assumptions to make. These 70%, 30% numbers that everybody cites, if you look, it is in the slender column design section of ACI 318. Those are stiffness assumptions that you are supposed to make in analyzing slender columns by ACI 318. The stiffness assumptions, as you point out, are in chapter 8, not in the column chapter. And there, all we say is any set of stiffness assumptions is good provided they are consistent, or something like that. So if you want to assume your numbers were 70% of I sub G for columns, 35% of beams, that is totally fine. Those are, in my opinion, a little bit on the low side. The other thing is, why are you analyzing your structure? Is it for deflection calculation? If it is for deflection calculation, you should take the stiffnesses on the low side, and then I think the 70-35 are good numbers. If you are doing stiffness assumption, if you are doing your analysis for the computation of design forces, then maybe you should go a little bit higher. I don't know, somewhere between 70 and 100% for the columns and maybe 50% for the beams. It's in that range. It is not okay. And this 1/2 for everything, that was something that UBC came up with. I personally do not like that as a stiffness assumption. As I said, it is up to the engineer. You can make really any assumption that you think is reasonable, and you have to satisfy the agencies like Rajuk that your assumption is reasonable. But as I said, the range for columns and shear walls should be between 70 and 100% of gross. The range for beams should be from 35 to 50% of gross. And something I was about to say. What assumption you make depends on the purpose of the analysis, and some of the time we would start analysis with assuming, let us say, high stiffness for a shear wall, then look at the moments and see that the cracking moment is exceeded, and then for the levels of the shear wall that are cracked, we will make the stiffness maybe 35% of I sub g rather than 70% of I sub g and redo the analysis. That's another choice. So, but the bottom line is it is up to you. In section 8.8, we refer back to the stiffness assumptions in the slender column design section. But from the commentary, those are never imposed on you. Please remember that stiffness assumption is up to you. It is not code imposed. Okay, what's the next one? Okay. Facing sound problems. That's not a question. What are the factors affecting the fundamental period of a building? That is pretty simple. Okay. Sometimes we see there is a significant difference between time period that we have calculated by the equation and time period we have measured by natural vibration recording for an existing building. Yeah, so period, as we indicated, is a function of mass and stiffness. So those are the two factors. This is why your stiffness assumption changes the period that you calculate. Now, previously we talked about analytically computed period versus approximate period. This question now is approximate period versus measured period. So significant difference between time period that we have calculated by the equation and time period we have measured by natural vibration recording. Okay, so it is the same thing. What you will measure will typically be larger than the approximate period, because approximate period is deliberately designed to give you a period shorter than what we expect the real period to be. I see there was some sound problem today. I don't know. There are several comments about I cannot hear, which concerns me. But
I think that's on their side.
Yeah, maybe.
Listening on their
Yeah,
side.
check. It is probably at your end, because Maria was listening to the Maria and Pro both were listening all the way. Anyway, higher stiffness produce higher frequency, which may equating for human comfort. Please give a suggestion for balancing both. Higher stiffness produces higher frequency.
I think he meant irritating.
Accelerations probably is what he means, which may, yeah. So if the accelerations are higher, the third derivative will be higher, and the fourth derivative, which is related to human comfort, will also be higher. So the two are related. there is no, I don't know, balancing both. I do not know. If you are designing for human comfort, if the building is such that human comfort is an important criterion that you want to consider in design, then only place I'm aware there is real guidance is in the Canadian National Building Code. It's not anyway, if that's what you are trying to do, there is literature available, you have to study it and try to do it. uh, uh, Guidance cannot be given in a few words. It's a pretty complicated topic, like designing
Human
design.
human comfort is not really a concern for seismic design, is it? Even
Typically,
for
yeah.
serviceability related matters. I mean, because this earthquakes not last that long.
No, that is also a very important point. So when we talk about human comfort, it is typically due to wind because that is an everyday occurrence. And there are ways of assuring human comfort. As I said, there is guidance available. Earthquake, as I said, I think emphatically our preoccupation so far has been preventing collapse in the maximum considered earthquake. We expect damage, forget about discomfort in the design earthquake. So, but what you say is true. If you have a stiff structure, it will experience higher accelerations, and everything that is mounted on the floors will have trouble. They better be anchored properly, attached to the floor properly. Those things have to be done. Okay, will we apply the damping value in analysis model for the material properties? I do not know exactly what you are asking, but normally in most of the work we do, 5% of critical damping is assumed because that is something implicit in the code. If you are convinced that your damping is lower than that or higher than that, there are ways of incorporating that in the analysis, and you might want to look at how to get it done. But vast majority of the time, we do not play with the damping in analysis. The 5% of critical that is implicit is what we use. For 70-storied RC building, reasonable value 2%, or 70-story RC building, 2% of critical damping is very low for concrete. Uh, at the same time, 70-story concrete building, you do not design by the code. The, for one thing, the period is too long for it to be affected by earthquakes. Your problem is most of the time not going to be earthquake. It will be to have a stiff enough building for wind. But more importantly, the seismic design has to be done and will be done without any question using nonlinear time history analysis or response history analysis, as we call it. And then we will figure out we will figure out about how the structure is actually likely to behave in an earthquake, and we will design accordingly. So 2% is definitely too low. Whether it will be 5% or some other number, the engineer will decide depending upon what he has inside the building, a number of factors. It's not to figure out a damping value is not something that is easy, and it is ultimately an educated guess. Can two
Does it depend on the number of floors? Like, does it matter if the building is 70-storied or 5 stories? I mean, the damping.
I do not remember that the damping people still use Newmark's table, And my recollection is not that he said that it is a function of the
Yeah.
flexibility of the building. That's not my recollection.
Yeah, my understanding is also it depends more on the material itself.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
the
yeah.
material used.
The damage potential, how much
Definitely.
damage is likely to happen inside. Can two identical structure having same mass have different natural period? Of course, if the stiffnesses are different, the periods will be different. Can two identical structures having same mass have different natural periods? Absolutely. It depends on mass and stiffness. So both have to be the same for the periods to be the same. This one. What is the allowable lateral displacement for seismic load for tall buildings? Allowable lateral displacements are given in the code. We have limits on interstory drift, which is deflection at the top of a story minus deflection at the bottom of the same story. And this is amplified deflection. That goes into details that will be covered in later segments, but the tolerable limits are very definitely given in the code. Okay, seismic weight is 25% for live load up to 3 kilonewton per square meter, and for live load more than 3 kilonewton per square meter, 50%. Kindly, can you explain the mechanism of this for this consideration? Thank you very much. Okay, so 25% of live load if it is light live load, and 50% if it is heavy live load. So the I do not, this is not in our code, so I do not exactly know the rationale. Maybe Dr. Rakib can, on a subsequent occasion, tell us. But my sense, just reading, and I saw that in BNBC. No, I didn't try to delve deep or anything. So heavy live loads will come from uh, storage, warehouse type of occupancy. And that is more likely to be in place than lighter live loads, which will come from regular occupancy, people sleeping, dancing, working, whatever they want to do on their floor. So that I think is the rationale for taking a higher percentage of the heavier live loads. And this is guess on my part, but I think that seems to me to be the rationale.
I have made Dr. Rakib a co-host now, so if he wants, he can unmute himself and say something.
Dr. Rakib, you have a more definite answer?
No, you are right. I think that is the reason, basically, particularly for industrial buildings.
Yeah.
The heavier live loads are more likely to remain during an earthquake event.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That is the reason.
It is it is 9:30. Our quitting time. Should we quit, or I don't know what do?
Maybe we can spend 5 more minutes.
Okay, I think there are 67 questions, so it's not going to. Okay. Okay, our common practice in grade beam. Oh, during structural modeling, we don't use brick wall, but practically brick walls are there, and inertia forces in building changes greatly. Your suggestion, please. This is a very an extremely important question. Okay, so this concerns me greatly. It's not only in Bangladesh but in many parts of the world, all over Central America, South America. What we build are reinforced concrete moment frames infilled with masonry, and I have seen things happen. Mexico earthquake 1985, I cannot tell you how many instances of this infill exploding. So yeah, you are right. Quite often the bare frame will be analyzed and the masonry filled in, and that's it. No other consideration. The reality of the matter is that when the masonry infill is there, you have a much stiffer building, shorter period, and it will be excited by short period ground motion. If the short period ground motion damages the infill, let us say we have an earthquake that generates short period ground motion, and the infill is damaged or it explodes, you will have a much more flexible structure. Now you are looking at a much longer period. It may or may not be in the critical range of the earthquake ground motion, but you know by now that if you have a flexible structure, the displacements will be large. So there may be significant damage to the non-structural elements and so forth. So the right thing to do is to analyze the structure with infill, the rigid structure, and also to analyze the structure without the infill, the more flexible structure, and essentially design considering the results of both analysis. This is the right way to go. This is not often done. I recognize that. The other thing that I haven't exactly preached, but I have brought it up many times. If you want to continue with this unreinforced masonry infill, and they reinforcing is out of the question. That can be done, but it is so expensive that it is impractical. So what has to be, and they have done it in Mexico after the 85 earthquake almost routinely. You kind of brace the infill. So you build either diagonals. So you have a 10-foot by 10-foot gap. You build diagonals from left to right and from right to left. Two diagonals will divide the 10 feet by 10 feet space into 4 triangles, which will be much smaller bodies of masonry. Those will be much less likely to be damaged. And if they're damaged, you don't lose all ports. The loss is gradual. And they don't have to be diagonal. You can build a couple of beams from left to right, there won't be columns, pilasters, whatever they are, up and down, dividing the space up into smaller cells. That is very effective. And then one analysis will be sufficient, because not much is supposed to happen to the infill if you take that approach. Okay, so hopefully I'm reasonably clear. So that is the answer to this. Is a very, very important question. Let me see.
Well, it is 10:36 now. So do you want to
let me take the next one, and that will be it. Okay, our common practice in grade beam or slab on grade level, the ground floor slab is rested on soil and no particular connection is available between grade slab and grade beam. Can we consider diaphragm action in that level? See, our common practice in grade beam or slab on grade level, the ground floor slab is rested on soil. I understand. No particular connection is available between grade slab and grade beam. No connection between slab and beam. So it's a slab on grade. Can we consider diaphragm action in that level? This is not an answerable question. A diaphragm has to be able to transfer So diaphragm, you remember, you have tension at one edge, compression at the other edge, and shear along the parallel edges to the excitement. And these shears at the parallel edge have to be transferred to something. And that transfer directly to soil is not something that is going to. So it's not making sense to me that if the slab is not properly connected to the great beams, that it will act as a diaphragm. I do not believe so. I definitely wouldn't try to do that. But again, Dr. Rakib, you have any different answer?
Dr. Rakib, you will need to unmute yourself if you are trying to answer. By the way, I was just wondering how much force a slab on grade would, as a diaphragm, would actually carry. I mean, at that level.
No. It can be substantial. Yeah. No. We
At the ground level.
Yeah. No. ACI has provision. The slab on grade can be utilized as the diaphragm, and sometimes it is. There is nothing wrong with that.
No, there's nothing wrong.
You have to design it properly. I mean, you have to design it for diaphragm action.
Sure.
So, Dr. Rakib may have left. I don't know. So, okay. So let us conclude here. I think it was good. We took a good number of questions today, more than ever before, I think. So hopefully you have enjoyed the seminar. Come back tomorrow. It will be a little bit different. In a way, I don't know. You'll see. You will judge for yourself. Okay. So thank you very much. I think the attendance at one point, I wasn't looking. At one point I looked, it was 548. So which is pretty amazing. So I'm very happy about that. And thank you so much.